everyone, and welcome to this video tutorial in which we're going to be looking at a tort exam question, and today we're looking at the topic of negligence. And I've got a mini scenario here for you today involving some characters from Bake Off. We've got Paul Hollywood and Mary Berry in here, and we're going to be looking at a structure for how you would tackle a scenario like this on a law exam paper. So let's start by looking at the facts. So the situation is this. Paul bought some cakes from Mary's food stall. Paul got food poisoning from cakes made with old eggs and missed 2 weeks of work. Doctors found that Paul was very susceptible to food poisoning. Paul had given some of his food to Ewan, a homeless person who also became ill for a short time, and you're asked to discuss Mary's liability in tort. Notice that this particular question doesn't tell you that it wants you to apply the law on negligence, and your exam questions won't always. Sometimes they'll just be like this and they'll say discuss Mary's liability in tort, and you would have to identify from looking at that situation, oh dear, she seems to have made an error with some eggs here, it's probably negligence that we're looking at, and then you would apply the law on it. So let's look at the steps for when you've got a scenario. What steps do you take to answer it to maximise your chances of getting full marks? So the steps that I advise you to take, we can remember using the word idea, and each letter from the word idea stands for a different step that you need to take. So firstly, you need to identify who the characters are and what the potential offences or issues, legal issues are in the scenario. You then need to define the legal issues that you've identified. You then explain those issues using cases, and then you apply what you've just explained back to the characters in your scenario. And if you do those steps, you should get a nice answer to the question. So on my next slide, I've got a bullet point answer to this question. Now, I'm sorry that there's a lot of content here on the slide, but the reason that I've crammed it all onto one is because I just wanted to show you, first of all, that I've highlighted on here the steps of idea. You can see I've got I, D, E and A. And I just wanted to show you first off how you can structure the answer. Now, you've got two options here with your idea structure. You can see I've identified, I've defined, I then explain in a big chunk, and then I apply in a big chunk. And you can do that using a straightforward idea model like that. However, the better practice would be to explain an element, for example, duty of care, apply it. Explain breach, apply it. Explain damage, apply it. So in essence, you would have ID, EA, EA, EA. And the reason it's better to do that in an exam is in case you run out of time. If you were to run out of time when you're writing this, you've missed out all of the application if you leave the application to the end. And also it just reads better if you explain a rule and you apply it. And you're also much less likely to miss something out if you explain something and apply it back. But some students find that challenging. That's why I've done sort of a straightforward idea, as I'm calling it, where I've done it in chunks. And when you're first starting out with law, it's easier probably to practice it like this. And then as you get more confident, I would explain a rule, reasonably foreseeable, using my cases, and then I would apply that straight back to the characters. I would explain the rule on proximity, using cases, and then apply it straight back. But for the purposes of this tutorial, we're just going to do it like this. I'm going to explain everything first, and then I'll apply everything in order back to our characters. So firstly then, we've got the identification. So you always need to identify and name the characters in your scenario. So I've said Mary Berry might be liable in the tort of negligence for Paul and Ewan's illnesses. So I've recognised that there are two potential claimants in this scenario. I've also identified the area of law that I'm going to be applying. And because I've said it's negligence, that tells me that I need to define negligence. So the first thing to say are that there are 3 elements needed to be proved in order to be successful in negligence: duty of care, breach of duty, and damage. So I've defined the issue that I'm going to be explaining and applying. We now need to explain duty, breach and damage using cases. Obviously I'm very brief and bullet pointy on here. You will be writing in full sentences. But when you've defined it, you can see I've got duty, breach and damage. That gives you a plan really for what you need to be explaining. So we'd start off with duty of care. So duty of care, you would talk about Donoghue and Stevenson, and the fact that Caparo and Dickman gave us the 3-stage test for finding a duty. Was it reasonably foreseeable? Was there approximate relationship? And is it fair, just and reasonable in the circumstances to impose a duty? And you would explain those elements using your cases. And as I said before, it's nicer, it's easier, you're not going to miss anything out if you explain reasonably foreseeable using your cases and then apply it back to your characters. Explain proximity and apply it back to your characters. But as we've said, I'm going to do that later on for you in my big chunky A at the bottom. So now that we've explained duty of care, we're going to explain breach of duty. And you would start off by saying that in determining whether there's been a breach, we start with the standard of the reasonable man, and that comes from the case of Blythe. But you would then talk about situations in which the standard would differ or be altered slightly, depending on whether we have any particular characteristics and whether there are any risk factors involved. So you can see there that I've named some cases. So the case of Mullins, that case with the children fencing with rulers, and we decided that children are going to be judged by the standard of other children of that age. You would talk about learners, Nettleship, and Bolam and Fern as well. And risk factors, they're always things to look out for in your scenario. So have you got a particularly vulnerable claimant? Think about Paris and Stepney, where the individual was blind in one eye, so a higher standard would have been expected. Talk about Latimer, were any precautions taken at all by the defendant, etc. So you'd go through your cases. And as before, it would be nice to apply that straight away. But for the purposes here, we're going on to damage. So I'd be explaining the importance of proving damage in negligence using factual causation to start with. And there's some of our key cases listed. And also remoteness of damage coming from the wagon mound. So now that I've explained the rules on negligence, I'm going to apply it back to my characters in the scenario. Again, very bullet pointy here for the purposes of this tutorial. You'd be writing in full sentences. RF stands for reasonably foreseeable here. So the first thing I've said, and if you look, I'm going back to the first stage of duty of care test, reasonably foreseeable. It's reasonably foreseeable that people will become ill if you give them cakes made from old eggs, basically. So we seem to have satisfied that. Mary has legal proximity to Paul and Ewan because she is selling cakes. And you could apply the principle from Donoghue and Stevenson that manufacturers are going to owe a duty to the ultimate consumers of their products. And Mary also has the special proximity to Paul as well. So we've satisfied that second stage test. It's also fair, just and reasonable to impose a duty on Mary because she's not a public body acting in an emergency. So we've decided that she does owe a duty of care. The next issue is whether she's breached it. So I've used a different colour here to try and make it easier to follow. So Mary owes the standard of another reasonably competent baker, and I'm using Bolam to support that. But the standard should be raised, I'm saying, because it's quite high risk to be selling food to the public. You know, people have allergies, etc. So you should be owing a high standard when you're doing something that could potentially cause illness. From the facts of our scenario, it doesn't seem that Mary's taken any precautions to check that the eggs were in date. So you could use Latimer and talk about the sign being put up in the factory. We don't seem to have any precautions being taken here. And I've said that a reasonable baker with a food stall would have checked the ingredients were fresh. So on that basis, it seems that she's breached her duty. It also seems that we meet factual causation because our characters, Paul and Ewan, would not have been poisoned but for the cakes being eaten, and there are no multiple causes mentioned. You know, there's no other explanation in the scenario saying that, you know, there could have been something else that caused them to be ill. We can say that the damage is reasonably foreseeable because it's quite clear that it's foreseeable that the ultimate consumer of a product might be harmed. Now, you could talk about the fact that Paul gives some of his cakes away to Ewan, so Mary's going to be arguing potentially that it wasn't reasonably foreseeable that Ewan would be harmed. However, I would say it's reasonably foreseeable that if someone buys a cake, they might give it away, they might pass it on to a family member, give it to a friend. So I still think that's reasonably foreseeable. You'll have noticed in the scenario, hopefully, that it said in the facts that Paul was extra susceptible to food poisoning. And the fact that he is irrelevant. Smith and Leach brain, we know that classic rule that you've got to take your victim as you find him. So Mary's not going to be able to argue, oh, well, it's not my fault that Paul's susceptible to food poisoning. That's going to be irrelevant. She'll have to take him as she finds him. So it seems on the face of it, on the limited facts that we have, that Mary's going to be liable in negligence, and therefore our claimants are potentially going to be claiming damages against her successfully. So I hope that video was helpful to you. I do have some other videos on my channel on negligence, so make sure you have a look at those if you want some other examples.